Yay, we are live. And thank you so much for your patience with us getting to be live today. My name is Olga Bolotina, and I welcome you again. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm very excited to welcome Hopkins today, who is a dear friend and mentor to me. And I hope that his wisdom, his insight is really going to be valuable for everybody who is tuning in and who is watching live and replay. So Hopkins is the director of strategic partnership, which I think is an incredible role for him because he is so resourceful and so connected. So I think it's perfect. And Hop, I learned actually not from our conversations, but I didn't know that you're a certified arborist and you have knowledge in horticulture. So of course it doesn't surprise me, but I want to jump in, and I'm sure that a lot of credentials will come up as we speak, because you definitely did a lot of organizing and a lot of writing and a lot of things that I don't even know about. So I'm excited to share. How are you today, this morning? I know that there's construction going on, things. So, hey, exciting life.
Yeah. Well, welcome and greetings, everyone. Appreciate being here. Appreciate the invitation, Olga. And Zephyr, thank you so much for backing us up on the IT area. So yeah, how am I today? Well, given the global context of a pandemic and verging on economic global collapse, and with it seems like a resurging spike that we're experiencing right now, I feel relatively good. It has been a busy pandemic for sure. My life, just as many other people's lives, has been impacted by it, and we're doing our best to make the best out of it. And although folks call it social distancing, we are trying to live our lives as social beings and kind of just direct opposite, where we feel like it's important for these times to figure out ways to connect with people deeply and not just over Zoom, but when practicing as safely as you possibly can, given the co-determinants that your folks have, is to try to be in community with folks, both out in the streets and representing for the movement for Black Lives right now, or some of the things that we've been involved in is, buying groceries for our elderly neighbors, or doing some pet care for folks who can't necessarily go out to grab their pet food or get to the grocery store, or, do some of the lawn chores that they've normally been able to do. So having those kinds of community connections ahead of this has really kind of helped it ease, at least for my family and for those around us, into this physical distancing reality that we're now living in. And I appreciate the question, and we're doing well. I feel fortunate and blessed to be in this community. So, and thank you for having me. Now, how are you?
Boy, well, we were talking, so sometimes you think, oh my God, I'm going to have a perfect morning. I'm going to be on top of it all. And sometimes it just doesn't work out that way. But I'm good. I'm practicing, despite and because of it all, I'm practicing to take it all as experience and learn, and also reflect what can I do and offer in this moment of time. So, I'm blessed. I definitely, I'm looking at how can I be of help, because I really am blessed. So, so I'm good. I'm getting you. You see me closing my eyes because I was like centering, getting present. So, and meditation helps, honestly. I meditated this morning, and I'm like, oh my God, this makes such a difference to just take a moment and come to your senses. So, and I know a little bit about your background because we've been sharing so much, but because I see you as this really person who is doing so much for the community. And also another thing that I forgot to mention, you also community emergency preparedness, right? You engaged in, so you know a lot there. So how do you manage, and I just mentioned meditation, but how do you manage, what do you have sort of in place practices that keep you grounded, keep you patient, keep you active and energized? What it is that...
Yeah, that's a good question. And you did know, we may get some construction happening. They're doing some work. My neighbor's doing some work. So I try to navigate that as much as possible. If it happens, I'll just mute myself and then we'll just keep rolling like it's not even happening.
That's life. No?
Yeah, life is happening all around me all the time and around us all the time. So yeah, that's a good question. I do think that I've oftentimes thought about activism and social change work as a marathon race rather than a sprint, that pacing is really important. Right now, we're seeing one of the largest human rights, civil rights movements the world is seeing, and with Black Lives Matter protests and gatherings happening in all 50 states, in both rural and urban and semi-rural areas and in countries around the world. And the tendency, and this is in the middle of a pandemic. Mm-hmm. So it's is really resonating with folks, for folks to really get out, take the precautions to physically distance and to still go out and show up for what they believe is to be true and right. And how do I maintain is recognizing that as much as we'd like, the social conditions that we're resisting and the ones we'd like to manifest are not going to happen overnight. And so we do need to have some sort of physical, social, and mental practices that help us get through that. I used to meditate a lot. I don't meditate as much as I used to, but I still use that as a weekly practice in order to ground and center myself in moments of stress. I still stay physically fit. I still get out and exercise, and I think that's really important, as well as eating healthy and eating right and remembering to eat. There are days for sure that I just totally forget to eat. I may have one meal and then it's 4 or 5 o'clock. I realized I haven't even had lunch yet. And so I've had to take on things like literally scheduling lunch and having it alarm so that I actually remember to take the time and to not sit at my computer or my desk while I'm eating, to actually stop and just focus on eating. Another practice before the pandemic, and even now at the pandemic, is I used to, I like to have walking meetings. And I think you and I have shared one of those in Oakland when I'm there, is in order to get myself and my colleagues out of our office and in that sedentary position, to say, let's just take let's schedule a walking meeting and then do it that way. And then I really limit my social media. I'm somewhat active on some platforms, and other platforms I've just chosen not to engage because it's really can be overwhelming. And I think particularly for a Black person, Indigenous, or person of color, the last several years have been pretty intense in terms of seeing a number of tragic and horrific violations of our human rights, and from people who look just like me, repeated on repeat over and over again. It has somewhat of a re-traumatizing impact. So I try not to stay too much on social media and witness those things. And I also try to be very mindful about the things I post, because I know that can be very hard for some other folks to do. So I don't know. Those are some of the things I try to do. It runs the gamut. We have some dogs and rabbits and chickens, and we try to spend time with them and hang out and be in community with our four-legged, feathered, and furry friends. So
it seems like mindfulness, I think that sort of presence, that's what comes up for me when you're talking about your life. And it's true, we underestimate, I think that nature and other species on this planet give us so much comfort a lot of times. I think we underestimate it sometimes. So But you know what, you touched on, some, and you are intimately involved, and hopefully a lot of people who are tuning in are also involved or getting involved in the movement. But I want to step back just a little bit to give people, talk about where you come from, your family, sort of the what brought you into sustainability movement, environmental movement. And I definitely want to talk about what's happening in the country right now and in the world. Quite frankly, it's not just happening in the country. I'm getting messages from all over the world, and some are very, very instill hope in me, and some are absolutely gut wrenching. So it's interesting what's going on right now. But anyway, where did you grow up? I know you grew up in Texas, but what and how?
Yeah, I was born in Dallas, Texas. My majority of my family is still there, and historically, we come from East Texas, near the border of Louisiana. And growing up, I spent time in Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, Lincoln, Nebraska, Oklahoma. And then we'll get to another pivotal moment when I moved from the South to the East Coast in Chicago. And we can talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, my family's been in Texas for many generations. And in fact, we still have relatives that are living on the land where my great-great-great-grandfather and grandmother were slaves on. It's a very interesting story. The land was actually deeded to there are two families once the Emancipation Proclamation was recognized almost 2.5 years later in Texas. And the slave owners went back to Texas. Prior to doing so, they deeded the land to those two families, which constitute a large part of my family tree. And so we still have relatives that are on that land in East Texas. And a couple of years ago, my family and I went back to East Texas in order to visit our family cemetery, which is now a historical marker in East Texas. But yeah, growing up in the South was very formative and still has a significant role that it plays in my life in terms of my worldview and how I think about things. One of the things I do think about being in California and West Coast for a while, we lacked a little bit of the Southern hospitality that I'm used to. It's a little different out this way, but I can swing with the West Coast woo-woo, as we call it. So when I was about 9 or 10 or 11 maybe, we moved from Oklahoma City to the south side of Chicago, which really blew my mind. Went from a very rural situation to the south side of Chicago, which was very urbanized. And there it really sparked my interest.
Why did you move?
At that time, my mom and dad had split. My mom, I think, just wanted to get as far away from Texas as she probably could. I think in Chicago, I think we had some relatives there. And probably due to the Great Migration, where Black people left the South and moved north. And so we were in the south side of Chicago for a little while. And that really sparked my interest in, my political interest in urban planning and architecture. It just blew my mind the way in which, even coming from working poor background in the South, in the rural areas, there was so much open space and creeks and lakes, and you could hunt and fish, and so your level of poverty didn't seem as extreme. And when we got to the south side of Chicago, through planning process, it really has a way of truncating one's worldview and where one can go, and the built environment really can play that. And I would then go on to learn how in many public and federal planning processes and projects that were really meant to disenfranchise African-American communities and people of color communities in particular, where freeways were built through existing communities, or hospitals were built, universities through eminent domain, removed working class, working poor immigrant communities from their neighborhoods. So it really helped me, even at a young age, really kind of get an understanding of just how institutionalized our oppression could be. Yeah, and then I moved from the Chicago back to Dallas and went to high school and college, and then moved out west.
Did your mom help you with those realizations, or what role grown-ups had? I mean, because you mentioned that you were 11, 12 when you first came to Chicago, which I mean, I guess grown up enough to have a lot of realizations, and I think a lot of times underestimate children, actually, how much they understand and how much they feel and how much they intrinsically know. Or I should say, let me back up a little bit, because we underestimate ourselves when we are children, because I feel like it's a continuum. We're not just we like to, it's all sort of compartmentalized and broken down to phases, and it's like it's one human being. We underestimate ourselves, and then we sort of underestimate children, I think. So, but anyway, what role grown-ups played in that? Because design is pretty,
Yeah, that's interesting, and I do agree with the way in which we sometimes underestimate ourselves and children. And I think if you were to ask any young person today how they were feeling, they would be able to explain a lot about what the world, what is happening around the world, what's happening in the world around them, and I think they would probably be able to be very articulate about it. And so for me, my mother was not a quote unquote activist or organizer. That's not what she did for a living, but just being Black in the South required a certain level of organization and determination and bulldoggedness. And my mother definitely displayed a lot of that, and definitely downloaded a lot of that information, survival information, to me. And so when we moved to the South Side, I had a friend whose father was an activist, who was an organizer, who through those stories really kind of helped me put some things together. And when I got into my first couple years of high school, I went to took an interest in architecture and urban planning. And that's then when I began to understand a little bit more of the politics behind the planning process, and what the built environment could and couldn't do in terms of how it helps create a sense of freedom, openness, or how it could create a space of restriction and constriction. And then through there, just reading, I had my nose in a book as much as I could. And an English teacher turned me on to the poets of the Harlem Renaissance, and that really opened up my eyes. And Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes and the writings of W. Du Bois and many of the other Black literary champions really I was exposed to, and that put it into context. And this was during the 80s. So this was during the height of the Reagan era. And for anyone who knows about Chicago history, Harold Washington was coming into prominence and really did a number in terms of transitioning structural power in the city of Chicago. So I was growing up at that time, and there were adults in my life who were definitely helping us put some things into perspective.
I'm listening to you, and I have to say, I personally have so much to learn about American history. Of course, I grew up in Russia, so but it's not an excuse. I've been here for many, many years, and quite frankly, until I started working in politics, I didn't start learning a lot, a lot of history about racism in this country. I mean, all over the world, honestly. I mean, this country sort of, at the top of the list, unfortunately. But and a lot of people, I think, that don't know the history, and therefore they don't understand. They say, well, all of those things, especially, I talked with my Russian community. Oh my God, it's really is heartbreaking a lot of times. But they don't know. They don't understand that the laws were created specifically to segregate. The freeways, roads, buildings were built specifically certain way. And I think that, and that's what I'm trying to at least, educate and say, no, you need to learn the history before you can form an opinion. So I appreciate you talking about it, and appreciate you having patience to talk about it. And, educate me and others. So why, and then you moved back to Texas. Was it on your, well, you went to high school, but it's like in high school.
A couple years in high school, couple years of high school in Chicago, couple years of high school in Dallas, and went to college, and then I moved out west. I actually spent some time in Alaska on a fishing boat, and then I moved from Alaska to Seattle, and that was in the mid to late 90s. Probably gonna. That's probably something else you didn't know, that I'm like ancient. I'm old.
Hey. Hey, another thing. I mean, what's your secret? It was like, how do you stay, young and fit? And I think what you said, eating
lots of water, drink lots of water, eat healthy, and get some sleep. Right. 2 out of 3 aren't bad for me. I'll just say that, just in terms of confessing. I think this moment, Olga, to a point you were raising about having so much to learn, we all have a lot to learn, and none of us, in my opinion, are the type of people or leaders that we need to be today for the world that we're trying to create for tomorrow. So we all have space to learn and to grow. And I think this moment, and there have been others, but I think this moment, because it's the one we're living through right now, is an invitation. It's an invitation to the future, a future without police, a future without prisons, a future that's not predicated and built on the foundations of white supremacy and racism, a future that's not built on domination and control, a future that's built on collaboration and cooperation and equity and justice and positive vision for the future. And so I think this moment requires all of us to do some introspection and to focus on some self-transformation in order to get that internal work first. And then, we can also simultaneously be working on the external work. So to your point, we all have much to learn. And I am not at all versed in Russian history, although I have some very, moments in time that I can think of that are definitely from the 80s and 90s and that I think about. But yes, we all have something to contribute and something to learn in this moment. And
that's a separate podcast.
Okay, separate. The Russian history? Is that Russian history?
I'm not pretending to know Russian history, so I know, more than maybe a lot of people. But I'll write a book sometime about growing up in the 90s.
I'm looking forward to it.
Well, a lot of what you were saying is, it's interesting when you were saying the poverty, how the poverty is so striking in the urban setting and not so striking, because when I was growing up in Russia, my summers was spent on dacha and outside of the, in the wilderness, basically, and very basic, no plumbing, no, it was very basic, but I loved it, actually. I think now in certain level, I miss it, because it was so much, it wasn't about having stuff or having running water. Yes, it was a little bit inconvenient to go to a well and pull the bucket out of the well and fill your, banyo or something, sauna in English, to have to have showers and stuff. But that was part of fun, or part of connecting with the earth, and part of unpaved roads. And anyway, I as a child especially, I think I really appreciated that simplicity. But then of course, you look at the urban environment, it's very the difference is very stunning. So.
Yeah, I think we have a lot more stories to share between ourselves. Although my family moved from East Texas into Dallas, and part of that was because one of my aunts was sick, and the care that she needed couldn't be found in a small rural town. And so we initially moved to the next nearest town, about 25 miles west, and then that wasn't also adequate. So as I understand it, then we moved further towards Dallas. And I remember vaguely having gatherings with my siblings. We used to go stay with my great grandmother in East Texas, and she still lived in a shotgun shack, and we would have to go out and pump the water and heat the water for baths. And you know, I was a youngin', so you know, the story is I would, you know, of course, you'd be bathing in pre-bathed bath water. Someone else got it ready for you, and so, and not to glorify poverty for sure. You know, I think though that the experience of having some level of self-sufficiency, having a garden, being able to grow your own food, knowing where your food kind of came from, and being able to provide meals and some level of substance is very different. And so, yes, I enjoyed plenty of times barefoot, walking, playing around, and we had they had a farm, and so I spent a lot of time there as much as I can remember. And again, I'm not glorifying that. It was different for sure. And then moving to the urban areas and having the same level of access to sustenance where you could grow a garden or you could go hunting and fishing just wasn't there. And so it became a much different existence from an economic standpoint, whereas your standard of living necessarily didn't, your annual income didn't increase so much so, but your level of self-sufficiency definitely decreased. And so I definitely experienced that moving to the south side of Chicago.
Well, you know what, I don't know, you make me think that, you know, the definition of poverty and definition of wealth and how do we, I think we also need to redefine those in the sense that, you know, in a capitalistic society, especially, wealth is having a big house and living in the city and having a job and buying. I was like, to me, wealth a lot of times is like connecting to nature and being able to to have access. I think that's part of wealth. And so what do we? I'm not talking about not having enough food to eat. That's not what I'm talking. I want to be very clear about that. I mean, everybody needs to have access to everything that they need to survive and thrive. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that we are also in a moment of time when we need to redefine our values. What do we value and how we value, and what do we teach and profess out there in the world as valuable? And I think that's another conversation that I think I would like to have some time. And you know, it goes also to your. I really enjoyed is not the word. I think it was very deep and important. The article that you wrote for the Sierra magazine really touched me on so many levels. And one thing that's, you know, disposable lands, disposable people, and that just really landed in the sense that, oh my God, that the connection between, because a lot of times still people to this end, I mean, we talked about it before live stream, that a lot of people still asking that question, why, you know, we're fighting the environment, you know, environmental justice, why we have to, you know, fight for racial justice. And I think that was not a question for me, but that analogy landed for me on the sort of gut level that it's true. If we have disposable mentality for humans, for land, for everything on this planet and this universe, then I don't think we're gonna get anywhere. So and thank you for, I mean, there's so many points in that, so I highly recommend everybody to read the article, and we'll post. I think that we actually posted already in the description. So.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And the idea that racism is killing the planet isn't necessarily new. I think it's new to some in the mainstream environmental movement. And I come out of racial justice and climate justice movements, and it's been something that many of us have known. So I didn't come up with that idea on my own. It's through the work of other folks, like, you know, the first organization I worked with, People of Color Against AIDS Network, and we were fighting a pandemic, you know, much like we're living through now, in the guise of HIV and AIDS. And if you were to talk to someone back then, you would have probably thought it was a problem that was mostly impacting white gay men, which at the same time, that was the kind of public narrative, it was really impacting cisgendered African-American and women of color because of unsafe sex practices. And just, like we're having people who are debating whether or not to wear a mask. We had people debating back then whether or not they would wear a condom or not. And they were, some folks were less than careful about their safe sex practices and were affecting others. And so I learned a lot back then about gender and gender privilege and class and racism, patriarchy, heterosexism, homophobia. And this was in the mid 90s, where gender pronouns weren't the thing that were being honored, and there are lots of folks back then who I sat at the foot of to learn a lot about intersectionality and how this was really impacting communities of color much worse because, like COVID, there are so many other comorbidities due to the cumulative impacts of racist practices with the siting of extraction and the burning of fossil fuels or transportation of fossil fuels or incinerators being placed in Black and Indigenous communities and people of color communities, that they were already had a negative impact on one's health. And so when something else came along, it just increased the impact of that. So from HIV to particulate matter to asthma near major warehouses where they have tons, lines and lines of trucks coming and idling and spewing all kinds of chemicals into the air that then return back to the earth and negatively impact these communities. So racism is killing the planet is an idea that I hope that I could really break down clearly for folks that really connected a number of things, and sacrifice zones being one of them. And you spoke to this a little bit about the way in which we can just select or make certain places non-consequential as if they don't matter. And then thereby that also you can't get those sacrifice zones without disposable people, and believing that the people that live in those areas also have no value. And then the way in which you get those disposable people, you can't get that unless we have racism, or racism dehumanizes folks. And in the article, I break this down in terms of colonization and white settlers, the belief in the doctrine of discovery that was a religious foundation for much of westward expansion and the displacement and near genocide of indigenous people here in the United States, and then the enslavement of indigenous people from Africa, bringing them here to do the labor. So we can see those threads of looking at indigenous people and their land and their ways and their culture as being not seen as being civilized. So what would it matter if we displaced them and removed them from their land, or gave them blankets infected with smallpox, or killed a buffalo in order to move them off of their ancestral lands, and then force them to move and relocate in areas that were outside of their cultural and historical context. And then if we enslaved African people and denied them their language and abused them and terrorized them and bred them and used them as capital for the wealth of this country, and then freed them and then created another a post-Reconstruction era of Jim Crow, we then continued to disenfranchise them, and so on and so on. So I really tried to make it, to try to connect some dots with the very few stories in the article. And I appreciate you sharing that link with folks so that we could then do that. And I think it's particularly important for organizations like the Sierra Club and our members to, and other white environmental organizations and well-meaning white folks to really begin to make these connections. And then this moment that's being led by the Movement for Black Lives is really doing a lot to try to highlight those connections as well.
I think you did an exceptional work. I mean, again, coming from my perspective, reading, and again, I don't know what I don't know yet. But for me, I think I really recommend everybody to read the article. It was definitely connected a lot, as you mentioned. And I think that that you pose the question about then that you don't have all the answers. I don't think anybody has all the answers, but I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, we sort of touched a little bit in our off-camera conversations that I think we need to have difficult conversations, and I think that everybody in such a different places in terms of their processing of trauma. And I think that I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional, but I think without having those difficult conversations, emotions still come up, fears still come up. And if they're not addressed, if they're not talked about, if they're not questioned and sort of discussed, I think they go deeper and express themselves in a very, potentially destructive ways. So, and it's interesting, I met with also another activist, another, white woman, and we talked about this, and it's like, we need white folks. I think one of my answers for me right now, that need to organize spaces where we can discuss things and not put our Black friends, people of color, and this role of educating us. Let's educate ourselves. Let's learn. Let's discuss, and invite people, all people to participate, but be very clear that some things can come up that are traumatizing. Some people can. I mean, I can ask questions sometimes that be probably dumb and ignorant and unaware. So, but invite whoever is ready to, in their emotional states, to listen and to answer questions. And that, I appreciate you, because I feel like I personally can come to you and be vulnerable in those ways. And I without also, anyway, I don't want to go on and on about myself, but we all processing. I think that's
well, we work together in the Sierra Club. We're friends and colleagues, and so I appreciate you bringing that into the room. And your conversation with your white colleague is really important. And I talk about that in some of the other articles I've written. And I think that is a large part of the work that we need to be doing right now, is that there are so many people that are newly coming into this idea, and their worldviews are being tested. Some are cracking and shattering, and we need to create spaces where we can then, I call it a community of care. It's not my term, but it's something that we need to, and I've encouraged everyone, not just white folks, but everyone. We all need to recover from white supremacy, and Black and Indigenous people of color have the internalized racist oppression that white supremacy has forced a sense of inferiority on us, and we need to deal with that. And there are then issues that we have that are intercommunal between BIPOC folks, or Black and Indigenous people of color folks, and white folks have an internalized racial superiority that needs to, and it goes beyond the borders of the United States. It's global. At this point, I would actually say it's galactic. I mean, we've been putting so much hate into the universe that if intelligent life, as they're coming to our planet, they're receiving all of these messages. So I'm almost concerned about what first contact will look like, to be quite honest with you. I mean, I know it's devastating to me, and it may sound funny, but I literally believe what will people, or what will these life beings feel and interpret by the time they arrive. But I think, once again, those individual conversations are critical. You to your friend, that dinner table conversation, that someone says something that in the past you may have let go. I think you have to actually stop and intervene in the most compassionate, empathetic way with your coworkers, with your children, and gets to a piece of what I like to ask is, what is it, what the difference between charity and solidarity? Charity is something I'm doing for you because I just, we're not equal. You can't do for yourself, so I'm going to help you. As opposed to solidarity is, well, both of us have skin in the game, and we both have, although it may not be the same, but we both have things to lose if we don't collectively join forces in order to pull ourselves out of this situation. And that's a question that I think for white folks has been challenging in previous moments and in this moment, to really understand what is your skin in the game for ending white supremacy. And I'd like to just ask that to my white colleagues and friends and family members. And if they begin to say that it's for some extrinsic purpose, like I want to help those people, or it's unfortunate that it's like, well, hold on, but why do you want to end, and what are the impacts of having and living in a white supremacist society? What impacts do they have on you directly? So yeah, I think those are some very important conversations. And just to plug the, showing up for racial justice as an organization, a white organizational forum that recruits and looks for questioning, and concerned white folks about racism and white supremacy. That's a formation that you can go to, or White People for Black Lives is another formation. They have chapters all over. I'm certain there's a chapter in the Bay Area. So I would also suggest that folks try to find whatever community of care, start a book club. I mean, the New York Times bestsellers look, I think the top 25 now are all books on race and racism. And I know a lot of those are cropping up. So kudos to you for having that conversation. And I do think that that's an essential part of what we should be doing right now.
And I think that thank you, Hop, and thank you for allowing me to have this conversation. I think that I can speak for myself, and I also see that then some of my white friends that the fear of saying or doing something wrong that is gonna get some reaction, and I'm saying to myself, you know what? Yes, you're gonna say something wrong. You're gonna probably do something wrong, and some people will interpret the same thing differently because we all individually different. I mean, Black people are individuals. They have their different opinions, their lives, indigenous lives, and we all are having individual experiences as well as collective experiences. So I invite myself, and that's something that I'm processing. Is like, okay, Olga, step over the fear. Check your intention. I think you're absolutely right with that. What is your intention in what you're doing? Be clear with yourself. What is it that your intention is? And come to the situation with that intention. And, at least you're clear with yourself that, yes, somebody might react. That's fine. Handle it. It's okay. Black people, indigenous people in this country have been suffering for generations. So you can take a little bit of a feedback. And so sometimes it comes in a not form that you want to get it, constructive criticism or something. That's okay, and something that also some of the other articles that you send me, people are saying is like, you know what, you can't have a protest and handle and be in a difficult, stressful situation for months or two. We Black people have to live it every day. So I was like, that's inconvenience that, or fatigue or stress that white people are talking about. You know what? That's okay. Just do some practices that keep you centered. Eat well, drink well, sleep well, meditate. Do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, and don't put it on others. So.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important part. Is so, like I started out with the
coffee. I saw that, the fatigue. You need to sleep more.
Yes, I've been known. I actually didn't start drinking coffee until I was well into my later years in life. I'll just say that it wasn't an instrument that I utilized until much later in life, and I use it sparingly. I think I am high energy enough that too much coffee for me would just make me unbearable, I think. But I do think your point that you're making is related to a point I was making earlier about that this is a marathon. And I think that we will be, experiencing some backlash. We're experiencing that now. We're experiencing more, and the large protests may wane, and there won't be so many murals being made, and maybe we won't have so many victories at the city council or county council or the school level where police are being defunded and the budgets are being reassessed. And that's when we have to find that next gear in order to keep going. And as you mentioned, for white folks who've been new to the game, this thing you're speaking of racial justice fatigue, or I'm not sure how it's being couched. Black and Indigenous people have been living this, and other people of color for centuries. And so I do think that's some work for folks to do, and they need to dig deep. And that's why it's helpful to have an intrinsic reason why you're in this struggle. Because if you're externally driven, it's going to be more likely that then that will become less important as it becomes more and more challenging and difficult for you personally. So you have to have some personal stake in it. And I hope that in this, that we will also take note of some of those, organizations. There's this term that I've learned out of the EJ community, which is, we have to move at the speed of trust. And that's one of the things that I think folks who might be newer to the movement may be expecting right away, is that they trust that they can have some of these kind of conversations with other folks right off the bat, and aren't able to necessarily navigate their own awakening, particularly as it relates to having your Black or Indigenous or people of color friends answer and educate you. Some of that's just going to have to be on your own. And I think a society doesn't prepare us not to get the instant gratification that we want. We have a thought, we say it, and we want a response. And this work is some work that needs to be done maybe by yourself, and then along with some other white folks. And again, people of color also have some work that we have to do. And once again, I said, I firmly believe that none of us are who we need to be or would like to be in order to move into another world. I mean, think about just a participatory democracy. What does that look like? Many of us don't know any other way to practice other than majority rule. And there are a number of different ways to make decisions. And I don't think we can take majority rule decision-making process as the overarching decision-making process into a different future that's more collaborative or cooperative.
Yeah, and I think that, it comes to mind that I think we need talk about access to services and access to education and access to resources, and what inspires me in this particular moment in time, and I've been also to demonstrations before, and those splashes, something happens horrific and everybody reacts and everybody goes home and sort of lives their lives because it's just what it is. But now I feel I people are starting to pay more attention to politics, and how those structural things that have been built in and ingrained in the society need to change, and where we're putting our resource. And I think that's really, where they say, if you want to demonstrate your value, put your budget. So, and I think that a lot of communities are taking it really seriously right now, and elected officials grapple with this. I think they also stepped into the system that was already sort of rolling, and to stop that system, unravel it, really get present what is important. I think that's what's happening right now. I think, it's been forced, but nevertheless, I think that's a good force that coming right now out of perfect things, but at least people are stopping and dismantling some things. And I hope that it will continue. And one of the things that I'm a big believer in, that we can talk all we want, and I think conversations are very important, because to speed of trust, actually you said that and just really resonated, because somewhere I heard, it's not my expression, you cannot be efficient with people. You have to do the work, you have to do the emotional work, you have to be willing to do the emotional work, to be there with people through through everything. But I just lost my thought. think I'm going in a
No,
tangent.
well, what I would say, I think
I wanted to say really, really fast.
The budget,
That,
I think you were talking about resources.
yeah, that strategic, consistent action. I think that's the only thing that, not the only thing, but that's the thing that will get us. It's like, what am I doing every single day, every single hour? What am I doing within the Sierra Club? What am I doing within my, friend circles? Every day you have to think, and like environmental protection should, I think, should permeate every single conversation, every single business, political, I don't know, whatever practice. Race, equity, and justice should be at the same level. We should be, it should be not just a side conversation. It should be everywhere we do. And I think that takes a little bit of a, twist of mind to do that for a lot of people. So anyway, sorry.
Yeah. Well, I think this moment is, as I said before, it's is an invitation into the future. And we need to be united and be in right relationship with each other in order to form that multiracial, multi-class, intergenerational, unified front in order to combat the fossil fuel industry that has dominated so much of how we live our lives. We can use this moment to demand the things our communities have.
Water.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been, we can use this moment to demand the things that our communities have been asking for and fighting for decades, and my hope is that in hundreds of city councils around the nation, activists will put it to those elected officials to rethink, reimagine, and reprioritize those public dollars in a way that is really like a down payment for the Green New Deal and other yet to be named and develop policies that seek to readjust and more equitably utilize those resources in a way that provide for more parks, that provide for more teachers, that provide for more healthcare workers, that provide for healthcare that's accessible for folks, and this moment is asking us, particularly, we signed on as a Sierra Club to the Movement for Black Lives platform, and then signed on to a number of things that required us to then follow Black leadership. And I think that that's been an ask that has been made before that I don't think the world has heeded as much as it is now. And I think in this moment, Movement for Black Lives is asking us to follow Black leadership into the future. And I think together we are going to reverse the impacts of climate change. I think we're going to build healthy communities. I think we're going to stop racism from killing the planet. I think that we can build a better and brighter future for us all. And I think that what I'm hoping that people take away from some of the articles I've written and from anything else I've ever said is that, Black people aren't in this moment just trying to save ourselves, but we're actually trying to save us all and trying to save the planet. If we can get to a place where Black lives matter, then all things will rise. And we've seen that historically from the most recent, the last civil rights movement. And I think that if we can rise to that occasion and begin to listen to, organizations that have been doing this work for a long time, Harambe House and, the Indigenous Environmental Network and groups like SEHA here, California Environmental Justice Alliance in California, and other grassroots environmental groups on a local level that have been struggling without the type of resources that our organization has been afforded and still winning. I think that we can follow these groups into the future that's much brighter, that's much more equitable, because a transition away from fossil fuels is going to happen. It's inevitable. Oh, yeah. And as my friends from Movement Generation say, justice is not guaranteed as a result of that. We could still have a green economy and still have it being built on the backs of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so by recognizing the connections between white supremacy, racism, and climate change will help us live into that future in a way that doesn't allow for sacrifice zones, disposable people, and would have at its foundation for a new economic, social, and cultural structure, something outside of the supremacy of one made up racial category over others.
Thank you for that, and I think that's something also that again from your articles that realizing for people that there's deliberate pinning, you know, white people against indigenous or black people on purpose. Somebody is actually orchestrating that on you know, on purpose. So guarding against that and sort of really you know, making sure that people understand what's going on. So I think that, and also, you know, I think it's important to have people in power who have lived experiences, so they understand, they have empathy, and they also understand what resources are needed for the communities. So I think that's important, and I have a lot of hope. Thank you so much. I mean, we're coming to, I can talk with you for forever, but I know you need your rest. You need to start your long weekend. If you want to just briefly mention something that I maybe didn't ask you that you would like to mention. Yeah.
Well, well, first of all, thank you and Zephyr for putting this wonderful show together to speak to everyone and inviting me on the show and being patient with my schedule and the transition from last week to this week. So I definitely appreciate you.
Well.
Well, I watched the interview. Xavier was on point. It was great. Yeah. Well, I guess, you know, I would go back to everyone has a role to play. And it's helpful for us to understand what our own skin in the game is in this new world we're trying to create. There's some clear directives coming from the grassroots that they're asking organizations like the Sierra Club and the environmental movement and individuals to listen and respect the leadership of the grassroots and to, in this particular moment, follow Black leadership as movement for Black lives. And I think we need to think about this is a long-term, it has, I mean, you know, folks are just coming into it now, newly energized, but this has been going on for generations. And as we know, the arc of history doesn't always bend as acutely as we'd like it to. And so we ought to strap in and buckle up and be prepared for a rather bumpy ride and take solace in the fact that you're not the only one. Find other like-minded individuals and do the study, do the self-transformative work so we can do the external societal transformative work and, you know, pace yourself, take some time off the front lines and, but then put that time in the front lines. And there are many front lines in the struggle for a new just society. So you can be the best judge of what those are. And the moment sometimes will help you identify what your place might be. So go into it with open eyes, open heart, and open hands, and grab a hold where you can. And so thank you so much again, Olga, for all of what you've done inside the Sierra Club and for putting this show together and inviting me on.
Oh, thank you so much. I truly appreciate you, and I think you've been an inspiration, and I definitely want to follow your lead, and I appreciate you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in again on Friday afternoon. I hope you got a lot from this conversation, and we'll see you next Friday at noon. And please keep on fighting and keep on learning and keep on making those ripple effects within communities and your circles. So thank you.
Have a good day now.
Bye.
Bye, y'all.